Let's get to the diplomatic section of this. So let's go ahead and put this next one up there on the screen, which is that while all of this call for a no-fly zone and arms is happening in English and in Washington, in Ukraine and in their relations with Russia, there's a little bit of a different tack. So Ukrainian President Zelensky says that Ukraine will not become a member of NATO. Instead, he calls for new formats of interactions with the West and security guarantees. That obviously is a huge development, especially if you pair it with some significant progress in the peace talks. Let's put this next one up there, please, which is that Zelensky's talks with Russia, he says, are starting to, quote, sound more realistic. He adds this caveat. However, time is still needed for the decisions to be in Ukraine's interests. Our heroes give us the time defending Ukraine everywhere. Now, if you add in Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, there's some more. He says, quote, there is hope for reaching a compromise with Ukraine at the peace talks, and says, quote, there are absolutely specific wordings that are close to being agreed, which is specifically on neutrality for Ukraine and security guarantees for Russia. So we have brought you previously kind of, if the best case scenario, here's how it would go. The Kremlin said that they're pursuing demilitarization. They could claim through their military campaign, we've demilitarized Ukraine. We have destroyed their defense industrial base. On the Ukrainian side, they have to recognize Crimea. They have to recognize the DNR, the LHR, those breakaway Eastern republics, and they have to guarantee in their constitution that they will never join NATO or the European Union, any sort of, quote, Western bloc. However, as long as they get to keep their political leadership, that's not a terrible deal, given that it would completely take away all of the, it would take, the Russian forces would withdraw, they get to keep their political regime, they get to keep defensive weapons. At the same time, can you really trust somebody who's bombing the hell out of your country and who's just invaded you?
Yeah,
I don't know. It's tough, right? So it's easy for us to say here on this side of the Atlantic, oh, you should take that deal, but over there, obviously there's some bitter feelings, but from their speech, it's not a bad thing.
Yeah.
And things are also ramping up into U.S. contact with Russia, too.
Yeah, so a few more details about what is being reported in the sort of draft peace deal here. First of all, I think it's important to say that there is no way of knowing that the Russians are actually negotiating in good faith.
Yeah, zero.
That's the massive caveat here. And in fact, Max said on, is that how you say his last name?
Max, yeah.
He's been a wonderful follow during all of this and has done some of the best reporting, I think, on the potential outlines of a peace deal. And a Ukrainian source told him, listen, there's a likelihood this is trickery and illusion. They lie about everything, Crimea, the buildup of troops on the border, and the hysteria over the invasion. So that's the gigantic caveat that hangs over all of this. But we have to have some hope that a peace deal is potentially going to come together. Some of the other details here is that they say the 15-point draft would involve Kyiv renouncing its ambitions to join NATO. They seem to be ready to do that. That seems to be maybe, kind of the lowest hanging fruit. And promising not to host foreign military bases or weaponry in exchange for protection from allies like the US, UK, and Turkey, according to people who are involved. However, the nature of Western guarantees for Ukrainian security and their acceptability to Moscow, that could prove to be a big obstacle to any deal, as could the status of the country's territory seized by Russia and its proxies in 2014. So those are the big sticking points. If Ukraine says, okay, we're going to quote-unquote demilitarize, not have offensive capabilities, not host foreign bases on our soil, in exchange for that, we need some kind of a security guarantee from the West, from the US, from the UK, from Turkey and others. What does that look like? What does that language look like? First of all, we, have a vested interest in knowing what those sort of security guarantees look like, but that's also where you could have an issue with Moscow and then, of course, negotiating over those territories. So those are the sticking points, but the fact that you do have language on both sides indicating we're getting closer together, and you no longer have the Russians talking about denazification, which was the thing that really was just this broad brush, like anyone that we don't like that opposes us, we consider a Nazi and we want to get out of there. That also is a hopeful indication.
Those are totally hopeful. And the reason why we should support this is, look, also if you're Ukraine, you need to show the world you did everything possible in order to put an end to this thing. And then if the Russians do break their word, and let's say they're using this as a guise in order to launch a full-scale military attack, then the sympathy of the world will only be even more so on your side. side, if that's some trickery that they're up to. It's clear that the U.S. is now taking more of a diplomatic role with Russia. The first U.S. diplomatic contact, let's put this up there on the screen, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan had a call with his counterpart on the Secretary of Russian National Security. Now look, in terms of the statement, you don't get very much out of it. The fact that the call took place at all, though, that's significant. That's a good thing. Have direct lines of communication, talk to your adversaries, talk what the sticking points are. We're not going to know what the details are, but in the context of where the peace deal possibly could be going, it's all a good thing. Let's put this next one up there, which is that the Russians have released a 15-point tentative peace plan that would include a ceasefire and a Russian withdrawal. Now, to be clear, this is the Russian demands. What exactly is a part of this is, like we said, there's the Ukrainian constitutional commitments on NATO. There's also a guarantee of a semi-guarantee of the political leadership in Kiev. But the most significant demands are the ones that we have already put out.
Yeah.
Now, the important thing is that the document exists.
Yes. Let me say one other thing about this in terms of the U.S. Ryan Grimm. So the lawmakers are very eager. We showed you the aid package that's been rushed together, the massive amount, I mean, truly extraordinary amount of weapons that we've flooded the zone with in Ukraine. U.S. lawmakers are very keen on that part, and they like to talk about that part a lot. Ryan Grimm has been pressing Jen Psaki on, hey, Zelensky says, you know, give us these weapons, but the other part of his demand is help us more with the diplomacy.
Right.
Have you or will you empower him in those negotiations to be able to say to Russia, if you do X, Y, and Z, the U.S. and NATO will roll back their sanctions? Because that gives him a lot more ability and a lot more power in those negotiations. You know, if this is the massive stick that we've tried to use to batter Russia into submission here and get them to be reasonable in these talks, which is, you know, kind of a little bit of wishful thinking, but this is the giant stick that we've used. You have to be able to empower Zelensky to be able to say, hey, you do this, then we're going to, us and our allies are going to roll back these sanctions. The administration has not said whether they're willing to do that. And Ryan pressed Psaki at press briefing, you know, on exactly that. And she really wouldn't answer. So, you know, it's just this is another sign of the times, sign of where the bipartisan consensus is. They're all for sending all kinds of weapons and offensive capability and supporting the Ukrainians with, you know, I mean, we've talked about some of the intelligence that's in the coordination, military coordination, which is quite extraordinary as well. But when it comes to the diplomatic front and how we actually build this off-ramp and hopefully resolve this conflict, we get a lot less discussion. You have very few lawmakers pressing the administration on this. Of course, the media, and we'll get to the media later on, has nothing to say, pushing them in the direction of diplomacy.
Right.
It's always in the direction of escalation. It's always in the direction of more sanctions, more weapons, and all of that. So that's another thing to keep an eye on. To my mind, I think Ro Khanna is one of the only representatives who's really been talking about not just the military and the sanctions, but also, hey, we've got to empower the Ukrainians as much as possible in these diplomatic talks.
Yeah, that's right. You know, the ideal is that the way this works is that if the two of them, the Ukrainians and the Russians, can agree on some sort of framework, then the great powers need to get involved. And it would be Ukraine, and it would be Russia, the European Union, the United States, Russia, and China. And if those three, obviously Russia, you know, included in there, if those groups can come together and agree on a rollback with the sanctions, it would look a lot like the ideal of the Iran deal. That's how we got with the P5+1 deal, was to negotiate and create, you know, the architecture, the great powers, both in economic might and military might, coordinate that towards a singular goal. That is a possible way this could get done. Look, this is all wishful thinking. All of this could be a ruse. And, we've seen enough of these fall apart. I think I watched something like 20 ceasefires not happen in Syria. So don't get your hopes up. They almost always fail. But a paper I remember reading in grad school, which used to give me hope, was the more attempts at a ceasefire, the more likely an eventual ceasefire is likely to happen.
Yeah.
So that may sound like a tautology, but what it is that the more attempts that you have at peace, even though they're very extremely likely to fail, the more likely you actually are to have peace in the end. So trying to open lines of communication, which seem futile, frustrating, stupid, almost always break down. And yes, sometimes they do break down. You have to fight to the death, but it's actually pretty rare in the history of human conflict. So pursuit of peace in and of itself is a goal which is not satisfying in the short term, but can pay off in the long run.
Yeah, and there's two other reasons to be a little bit hopeful, which is, the very first talks that were held between the Russian side and the Ukrainian side, relatively short.
Yeah, that's right.
Couple hours, and that was that. These have been going on now for days, and they've continued the lines of communication. So that's one thing. The other thing, which you found, Saagar, let's go ahead and put this tweet up on the screen, is, you have some interesting rhetoric here from the Chinese.
Yes.
So the tweet, go ahead and put this last tweet up, A11.
Right.
There couldn't be a more powerful sign of which way the wind is blowing in Ukraine. China meeting with Ukraine officials in Lviv. So the Chinese actually came to Lviv. And they said, we have seen how great the unity of the Ukrainian people is. That's per the Chinese ambassador is quoted as saying. So the fact that the Chinese are there, that they are showing some, at least rhetorical solidarity with the Ukrainians is also, an indication that hopefully some pressure is being put on Russia behind the scenes to make a deal in good faith.
This is the Chinese version of there are fine people on good sides, on both sides. Yeah, very fine people in Ukraine, in Russia, good people. Sorry, I had to get that out of there.
Very true.
In terms of how Putin is talking, though, look, the hot language that continues towards the Russian people is very much there. Here he gave an address to the Russian people. We have a dub of that. Let's take a listen.
So we have exerted all ways to resolve the matter peacefully. The problem that occurred not by our fault, and in this regard, we were forced to launch this special military operation. The Russian troops near Kiev, near other Ukrainian city, has nothing to do with our intention to occupy the country. That's not our objective.
So that's a very key. Occupation is not our objective. Could be a lie. This could, they could say they'll stay there forever for peacekeeping. We've seen that before on many sides in terms of people. But I think that even though he has the hot rhetoric and he called out the oligarchs and all that, he's still saying, look, occupation is not our end goal. So that could be a signal to an off-ramp to the Russian people. We're just trying to read tea leaves here, and obviously we want to be hopeful, but it seems crazy until it's not crazy, until you have an actual peace deal, and we remain hopeful that
the language around the oligarchs was pretty interesting. Some real sort of populist flame throwing with regards to the oligarchs, which I think is probably pretty popular with his domestic audience. He says he's focused on a certain type of trader, those who, quote, earn money here in Russia but live there, meaning in the West, who like foie gras and oysters. So so he's trying to position himself as like, I'm the true champion of the people, and these rich people are leeching off of you, and they're anti-Russian, and those sorts of things. The reality is it's a completely symbiotic relationship. And the other thing I'd say about the oligarchs is I wouldn't hold your breath waiting for them to turn on Putin or have any sort of significant influence in ending this ultimately, because they don't like the Western sanctions. But thanks to our wonderful banking system, they, even under sanctions, have gotten richer and richer. So their livelihoods are not threatened. And number two, their wealth is completely dependent on this guy. So without Putin, they don't have the property and the rights and their ability to earn the massive ill-begotten fortunes that they have.
Yeah, there was an interview on The Realignment with Nate Sibley. He's kind of a sanctions expert. He explained this really well, which is that the way that we conceive of the oligarchs as an independent power base in Russia, it doesn't really exist anymore. That was the case from the early 2000s up until 2014. But part of the reason that Putin purged the oligarchs and Western influence is because all of the immense pressure that he got on his regime from the oligarchs when he took over Crimea. They were like, hey man, you're screwing with business. And at that time, they were very popular. So since 2014, he's undergone a campaign to basically root out, imprison, and destroy their power of those oligarchs and make them totally dependent on him. So they don't really exist in the same independent power base that they did in like 2006, 2007. It's a totally different situation now. It's much more like a like a top-down autocracy than it is anything else.
Yeah.
Just something to keep in mind, you know, for people out there. Who
By
are
the
like,
way, another thing to keep in mind is we helped create the system, and Matt Taibbi lays this out very well in the interview we did with him last.
Yeah, people should go and watch that interview. It did really well. I was happy about that.
Yeah, I mean, Matt's always really insightful on this stuff.
Yeah. Hey guys, we're going to be totally upfront with you. This is the most perilous time that we have ever operated in.
It is so difficult just to try to sort through the news, but even more importantly, to bring you accurate information as this wave of lockdown and censorship spreads across the nation.
Yeah, look, if you can become a premium subscriber today at breakingpoints.com, you're going to help us build out a vibrant, independent media ecosystem, which is free of mainstream pressure. We can't tell you how important that is at a time like this.
Yep, that's right. Go to breakingpoints.com to subscribe. We love you guys, and we appreciate you so much.